Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Our subject today is the bicentennial celebration of the United States Constitution. On September the 17th, 1987 will be the birthday, I would indicate the 200th birthday of the Constitution. During this year, throughout the United States, we are not only celebrating that birthday, but hopefully we're using this opportunity to understand better the Constitution and its importance within the democratic structure of the United States. In Idaho, there's a very special project that's underway. Under the project director's leadership, Alan Minskoff, who is from Boise and who's with us today, along with a grant from the Idaho Humanities Council and also sponsored by the Idaho Trial Lawyers Association, they're touring Idaho, and in 8 cities we are talking about the Constitution, and it's our time here in Coeur d'Alene. We're very happy to have Alan with us today, and I've worked with you on this project, and I can testify it's been a very special privilege to work with you and to better understand the Constitution.
Thank you.
I'm going to do something different on our format today. On our program, the 2 of our regular panelists are here, State Senator Mary Lou Reed and Mr. Steve Shink, Director of Informational Services at North Idaho College. But since I'm involved in the grant, I'm going to turn over the moderating of the program to Senator Reed, and Al and I will participate in the program. Senator Reed.
Well, thank you, Tony. This is fun to turn the tables and ask you questions for a change. I think, though, we probably should start with Alan Minskoff. And Alan, will you tell us just a little bit more about your project? How did you get the idea for a bicentennial birthday party? And what kind of reactions are you getting?
Well, first, the idea came directly out of a Hearst survey that was done on Americans' knowledge of the Constitution, or their understanding. And what they had determined through a very scientific poll of 1,000 Americans around the country was that Americans had a muddled understanding of the Constitution. And I think the kernel of our idea was that we tend to revere and honor the document, but not read it, talk about it, or understand it. So that's where we got started. How to get people talking, thinking, and reading, if not the Constitution, about the Constitution.
And so that's what you're doing. You're going around and encouraging people to talk. Is it really revealing that Idahoans also perhaps do not know as much about the Constitution as they revere and honor it?
I think Idahoans are pretty typical of the way the people in the country have come out in the Hearst poll. We are giving 9 of the about approximately 45 questions from the Hearst survey. And although Idahoans are doing a little better, we find at our meetings that when we ask out loud these questions that there are plenty of people who still are pretty much in the dark and who have not read the Constitution since high school or before. And there are plenty of people who are under tremendous misconceptions. One that bothered me a great deal was that people in an earlier Hearst survey, and this was corroborated later, thought that we were guilty until proven innocent in the court system. Half the people thought that. More than half the people did not know what the Bill of Rights was. A large number of people thought that English was established as the national language in the Constitution. These things, of course, none of them are true.
Tony, do you want to kind of toss something in here about what your students seem to know about the Constitution? Do we tend to forget as we get older? What happens is that the Constitution kind of fades in the background?
I've just completed a unit in American government on the Constitution in which the students were able to go through with instruction the preamble and the 7 articles and the 26 amendments. And I concluded that by today giving that same test that Alan is talking about. And although their scores were a little better than what the Hearst survey indicated, even after just walking through the Constitution, it was very disturbing. For example, a majority of the students in the class did not know who the Chief Justice was. They thought it was Berger, who of course had been Chief Justice, and some of them thought it was Brennan. That's just an example. I would certainly support the results of that survey. My experience over the years of teaching and appearing at different forums and talking to people, it's a minority of the population that has studied the Constitution and understands its application. I would add that the citizenry is supportive of the Constitution. They believe in it, but they've not become a student of the Constitution.
Well, Alan, it really sounds like you're off on a good project, that it's really something that is needed. Steve, do you want to toss in a question now?
I'm just wondering what kinds of things you are doing as part of this centennial celebration to focus attention on the Constitution as a document.
Well, what we are doing is we're holding meetings in 8 towns and cities across Idaho, and our meetings really divided in 2 parts. And we did that for, I think, a very good reason. The first part of the meeting is our lectures. Tony will be giving one tonight, as well as Justice Huntley will be up here, and Judge Judd, a district judge from your part of the state. Now, these talks are by design brief, 15 or 20 minutes, because if they're longer, we find that we lose the audience. And what happens after that is we open up the room to questions. And we're getting all kinds of questions, from what are the threats to the Constitution, how can I teach my children about the Constitution, why does it matter to us? You know, the Constitution is a document, but people forget that without this document, it's what differentiates our government from all of those throughout the Western world, throughout the world.
You raise an interesting question in your answer, and I'll give you an opportunity to expound on it, because I'm sure you'd appreciate that. How important is it to the average citizen to have an understanding of what's contained in the United States Constitution?
I think it's fundamental that we understand how checks and balances work in this country. I mean, in England, which is a country that many of us admire, if the head of the parliament does something like Richard Nixon did, breaks the law, he's simply the head of the party. There isn't a check and a balance like we have here. Here, if the president does something wrong, he goes in front of the Congress. And we have the power of impeachment, and it's part of our check and balance system. I think that we need to, if we're going to understand our rights, understand how our government works, how our country works, what differentiates our republic and our democracy from the rest of the world. The Constitution is a place to start. That doesn't mean everybody has to be beard, or everybody has to study it in the way that Mortimer Adler has just done in a recent book, or Catherine Drinker Bowen did at the convention. But I think to talk about the Constitution, to understand the principles, surely, of the Bill of Rights and of the fundamental document itself, are very important. And one other point is, I think that if you look at the amendments, they're kind of a shorthand in the social history of our country. The women's right to vote in the 20th century, direct election of senators in the 20th century, income tax was an amendment, the funny little give and take of prohibition and then repeal of prohibition. It's kind of how we learn about ourselves.
Given that importance, Tony, as an educator, while I think that the appropriateness of this celebration is unquestionable at this time, and I think your activities are going to have a good effect, it seems to me that the only way to really develop a fundamental understanding of the Constitution is through the school systems. How are we doing nationally, and in particular in Idaho, in terms of how we treat that important subject?
I have some criticism to the way that we teach the Constitution. I think we made a mistake of dealing mostly with rote memorization. We ask students within our system to name the Bill of Rights 1 through 10, and what is in the first, what is in the second. That's okay to be a first step. But if we just go with memorization, we don't understand the concepts themselves. I would suggest that, first of all, we identify the major principles in the Constitution. I think Alan has been referring to that already, such as the concept of federalism and also separation of powers. And I would give great emphasis to the 2 terms, freedom and equality. And then take those and teach all society about what those principles mean, and give examples or case studies. And in doing so, indicate to individuals that if those are eroded, then the system itself is in danger. Democracy is never assured for eternity. One of the things that I'll be addressing tonight is that from time to time there are very serious, in my viewpoint, threats toward these basic rights by suggestions through court cases that maybe we can do without the present interpretation. And if you have a gradual erosion of this process, democracy could gradually turn into something else that then the citizens would realize was not what they want, but it would be too late. I think you have to simply go beyond memorization and understanding the parts of the Constitution, but I like to use the term the living Constitution, the living document. And if we say it that way, in fact, our Constitution is the oldest living Constitution in the world in a democracy.
Well, do you think sometimes we talk about these abstract ideas, and that's where people get lost? And do you think it helps to go back in time and go back to 1787 and talk about the living, breathing human beings who felt the need to have this Constitution, so it had direct meaning upon their lives. Are you using in your programs the individuals and actually the need they felt for the Constitution?
Oh, absolutely. I think.
And who are some of these people?
Who are some of these people? I think the major player most people accept was James Madison. He is the person who is giving most credit as the key player at the Constitutional Convention. To me, the Constitutional Convention is a great example of how people met a need and were able to compromise. Very divergent opinions were able to compromise. You had large states in terms of population, Pennsylvania, Virginia in those days, who had different kinds of needs than small states like Delaware, which had a very small population, and Connecticut, and yet the people were able to form what they called the Great Compromise, the convention, because they saw that the needs of the big states, the needs of the small states, all had to be umbrellaed under the greater need of a country that was really in deep trouble, in commercial trouble. We had debts we weren't paying. The Articles of Confederation was a very weak document in terms of establishing a government, where the Constitution became a much stronger method of establishing a government. And you had Benjamin Franklin at the convention. We had some of the most brilliant men in American history. George Washington presided over the convention, and he was probably the single key individual who made that convention work because of his eminence presiding over the convention. Alexander Hamilton was there. There were many, many of our really founding intellects, not just framers and founding fathers, but people who had really studied history and had really studied philosophy.
Where did they get this sophistication, really? How did they understand the power and the balance of power? Because I think that's one of the brilliance, the genius of the Constitution to some extent is its understanding of checks and balances and its understanding of power and the misuse of power, or the understanding it reflects. Where did they acquire this depth of experience and intuition?
Well, I don't think it came like Topsy. I think that they were students. Madison had gone to Princeton, had studied Hobbes, and had studied Montesquieu, and had an understanding of the great European thinkers, Locke especially.
Intellectually, then.
Yeah. And not only that, I think that they had experience from the Mayflower Compact right through state constitutions. The Constitutional Convention was not the first time on this continent that we had constitutional, we had not constitution making. I mean, it was, as I'm sure Tony can elaborate better than I, it had been done in the colonies themselves.
Tony, do you want to add something about the background that gave the depth to both these people and to the actual experience?
I think Alan is very astute with his comments. First of all, I've always been amazed at what few were involved. 55 people, or 55 men at that time were at the convention itself to write the document. But they'd had tremendous experience prior to arriving in Philadelphia. They'd experimented with some other things, the Articles of Confederation, and through the failures of that document, I think they learned an awful lot about what they should be doing. The Declaration of Independence had given them an opportunity to talk about principles and ideas. They'd been through a revolution, and many of them had experiences in states. Mason, for example, was very instrumental with what happened in Virginia, dealing with some very key things for the Bill of Rights that came on later, just right after the convention. I guess I'm also very impressed that they had such universal knowledge about what a structure should be when they did not have long, long history of democracy in other countries, and yet were so young. I was reviewing the other day some of the characteristics of the writers of the Constitution. Most of them were in their 30s. Ben Franklin was an exception as an elderly man at that convention. And if I can relate that to today, I'm amazed that it seems that people need so much more maturity before they become national political leaders. We were talking about one candidate now is 39 years old, and they say he's too young to run for president. Well, he'd have been one of the older members of the convention. So I do think they had a very special experience and ability, and I just simply think they had a very universal outlook, and therefore I think that found its way into the Constitution.
Steve, your turn.
Alan, you mentioned that the Constitution, in most of our visions, is a very cherished and revered kind of document. Is that and we've been talking about it a little bit, and I noticed you were ready to add something to Tony's comments, so maybe this will feed right into that. Is that sentimentality? Is that national pride? Grade that document, the one that came out of that particular effort, not the one that we have today, but the original Constitution. How'd they do?
I think they did extremely well. With the addition, absolutely with the addition of the Bill of Rights. Jefferson said without the Bill of Rights that the document was flawed, and I think that is how I see it. Tony and I talked about this at lunch, and I think that's the fact. What I wanted to add was something that former Governor Smiley said in Boise. He said that it might not have been an accident that people like Sam Adams, who was a radical, Patrick Henry, who was a very kind of intransigent guy and a brilliant speaker, John Adams, who was in England, Thomas Jefferson, who was in France, some very, kind of unusual leaders, some of our more radical leaders, Thomas Paine was on his way to Europe, were not at the convention. He thought that the people who could make a constitution were there, and some of those who were more radical were other places. And it is interesting to note that in the ratifying conventions, some of those people like Sam Adams and I don't think Jefferson got back. He was still in Europe. But Patrick Henry was a staunch anti-federalist, meaning that he was against the Constitution. And it took some real political brilliance at the Virginia Convention to neutralize the power of Patrick Henry. He was really one of the great speakers of his period, of his age. And some of these people weren't there. So,
one of you give us a little history lesson. How far after that original document was written was the Bill of Rights accepted?
2 years.
Yes. Probably the most healthy debate that ever took place in the United States over an issue was following the convention. It was rather obvious that the Constitution itself was not going to be approved. There was just simply too much opposition as the debate took place in the states between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And it was somewhat a concession on the part of some of those who had authored the Constitution that they would agree to attach on the Bill of Rights, the 10 Amendments, immediately after the adoption. And that was an agreed upon idea as the debates took place in all the states, and yet they still had to have votes over those people who could vote at that time, and those took place in 1791. And I'd like to add to that that as brilliant as they were, they did make in my viewpoint, a flaw by not having the Bill of Rights. And if those had not been added to the Constitution, that document would be not the document it is today. It would be greatly flawed. And I would think in this country today, that a lot of the basic rights that we appreciate and enjoy would not be here. In fact, I would even argue that the democracy would not have been developed nearly to the extent it is if there had been democracy at all. So it was a great debate, it's a great contribution. I think we should learn a lesson from that, and that lesson is that we should encourage debate rather than trying to prevent debate on major issues in this country.
Why do you think they were left out in the first place? And they certainly must have been discussed in the course of the Constitutional Convention. Why were the Bill of Rights something that had to be tacked on? Is it because you really can contrast the body of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and what they're addressing?
Madison wanted them within the Constitution. I mean, it was one of the things that he lost at the convention. I mean, as great a figure as he was, he didn't win some of the fundamental things he wanted. He wanted direct election of senators. He didn't win. Bill of Rights he wanted right within the Constitution. But you have to remember, slavery was an extremely emotional and hot issue at this convention. I mean, there were states where slavery was abolished. Massachusetts had no slaves. South Carolina and Georgia had lots of slaves and was a big part of their economy. People like Madison still owned slaves, although I think philosophically they had already moved away from that position. So the first 10 amendments became kind of a political football at the convention. And the way to solve it, they finally adjusted their thinking by saying, well, we'll let it happen right afterwards. And I think they knew that. And what happened in the conventions is that they made recommendations. In Massachusetts, I think, was the first one where they said, well, we'll accept the Constitution, but we want to make these recommendations, and that opened the door for the Bill of Rights.
You talk about people's concern for the threats to the Constitution. I suppose I should preface that by saying, are the needs changing? Are the needs different that they were when the Constitution was enacted? And are potential threats to the Constitution actually because of changing needs and changing times? Or can you kind of
Well, I think that's to the several
launch
questions.
into that?
I think one answer, I could paraphrase Congressman Stallings, who spoke in Pocatello, where he said that he thought the threats to the Constitution came from the so-called super president, this imperial president gaining more power than was actually given the president in the document itself. He thought that that was one real threat to the Constitution, taking over foreign policy. This was not what was intended.
When you say threat to the Constitution, you mean threat to
our constitutional government.
The way the government
If we have a super
works,
president, then
right.
he has gone beyond what he has been posited to do, what we had hoped our presidency would be, what it is actually written, how it is defined.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, we did this in one of our meetings, and I thought one of the real threats to the Constitution was ignorance. I think illiteracy is a threat to the Constitution. Ignorance is a threat to the Constitution, and I think that any time, to go back to what Tony said earlier, people who are against liberty and against the fundamental principles of our government, you got a few of them not too far from here. And I think that those people are really direct threats. To lead right into Tony again, but I do think that these are threats to the Constitution.
They certainly can come from a lot of sources. They can come from a lack of understanding by some segments of society of what the Bill of Rights, and even others. We certainly don't want to forget the 14th Amendment. It's crucial to this process in both due process and equal protection.
Yes, mention what the 14th Amendment. You have to remember that all of us are not really all that current on our numbers.
First of all, what many citizens do not realize, the Bill of Rights, 1 through 9, where you really get into what we can do, such as free speech and right to assemble and all those other things, really apply as restrictions on the national government. They do not apply to the states at all. And if we had not added other amendments, that being the 14th, today states would be free to encroach upon all of your rights or search and seizures. And it was through the addition after the Civil War of the 14th Amendment, and then the court being active and willing, and that was the progressive members of the court, to say that most everything one finds in the Bill of Rights has now been incorporated either into the due process clause of the 14th Amendment or the clause that says no person shall be denied equal protection of the laws. And the 14th Amendment prohibits state action. So when you combine the 14th with the Bill of Rights, then all government in this country is restricted in encroaching upon the rights of individuals. And history before our country and since the adoption of the Constitution is full of examples of where given individuals, and some of them in government, would, if they could, really deny rights to individuals, particularly individuals in society who have been less fortunate than others, in lower income, less education. And as the court has reminded us several times, it has been the poor and the illiterate that have been denied their basic rights. And the role of government through the court is to make sure that that doesn't happen. And I don't think that very many people appreciate the magnitude of both the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment.
Would you talk a little bit about erosion then? Your concern in terms of threats is the erosion to the Bill of Rights. Is that correct? You're going to discuss the 5th Amendment, or is it going to be the 14th?
I'm going to be discussing the 5th Amendment, one issue in the 5th Amendment, that is that no person can be required to incriminate themselves, protection against self-incrimination. But I just chose that one because it was one of my interests, and Alan said we need to choose one. The 4th Amendment is also so very vital in the whole question of privacy and search and seizures. And the 14th, the Equal Protection Clause, one could go on all day concerning its importance. But from time to time one sees, even on the court, there are members of the court, the High Court, that indicate the exclusionary rule should be abolished. That disturbs me greatly, that evidence gathered, no matter how it's gathered, even if it's illegally, that it should be admitted to court. Well, I think that's at the root of justice, and I'm very disturbed about that. There are also people in government and in high positions who have indicated that they do not only want to do away with Miranda, that's not the issue, it's how best to do it. That individuals don't or should not know what their rights are when arrested. Now, if you start those kind of erosions and they're successful, then we have a less democracy.
Steve, are you ready for another question here?
I think I've got one. We've been talking for most of this show, or at least a good part of it, about amendments. Obviously focusing attention on the fact that the Constitution, as it was originally framed and as it stands today, are different documents. How different are they, and does the present Constitution hold the same tenor and philosophy as the original?
Well, I put it this way oftentimes with students. We have some wonderful dialogues, and from time to time someone will say to you that the Constitution originally was divinely inspired. And I always have to challenge that comment because, as Alan's indicated, there were a lot of political debates taking place at the convention, a lot of compromises, one of them being that the slave owners at the convention said, we want to count all slaves for representation in the House of Representatives, but count no slaves for taxation. That's not divinely inspired. That's a politically selfish position. Also, it involves slavery. As a matter of fact, the original Constitution in 4 different sections condoned slavery, support slavery. And that in itself indicates why it was desperately needed to amend the Constitution, which we've done 26 times. Although the original Constitution has many wonderful concepts on division of power and separation of powers and the genius of having flexibility written into the Constitution so the people of each generation can fit it to their times, there are also some very disturbing things in the original Constitution. And only through the amendments have we made it the beautiful document it is. And I take the position that we need very little additional change. If you truly interpret what's already there now, such as the 14th Amendment, you can find ways to always decide cases on behalf of the equality of people. But I am grateful that 26 amendments have been added for those examples.
Alan, do you want to comment on the amendments? You were saying the Bill of Rights was essential. Do you feel the amending process has also added a great deal?
Oh, I agree completely. I do think that the Constitution, though, is an elastic document, and as so, there are always changes that would be helpful. If I were a resident of Washington, D.C., I would not feel that I was enfranchised. I think if I lived in Washington, D.C., that I would certainly want to have representation in the House, and I think that that is something that could be done, probably through the amending process. But as I go through this process, I'm getting, well, I guess, more light is being shed on why a constitutional convention might be something that we shouldn't fear quite so much. We are mired in an enormous debt, and yet we don't look at some of the ways that we are creating it. We kind of have a constant election system, and perhaps people in the House of Representatives who don't change very much, as you know, the percentage of changes, I think less than 5%. Maybe we'd be just as happy with a 4-year term. It'd be a heck of a lot cheaper, and it might give those people in the House, instead of having them run every sort of 12, 14 months, it would give them a chance to go about their business. Maybe we should have a little longer presidential term, perhaps.
But do you feel that the Constitution now is still valid and elastic enough that there is no real need for a constitutional convention or for the radical kinds of things that went on after the Articles of Confederation proved not to work?
Well, I would just say real quickly, we're about out of time, so I'll intervene at that point. I think Alan's talked about some of the things that are still lacking, like the right for people to be represented from Washington, D.C. in the Congress. But at least I think many of those things can be done with an amendment rather than a complete rewriting of the Constitution. He seems to be agreeing. I'll have to cut it off at this time.
Tony, back to you.
Thank you very much for moderating. It was a pleasure to be on the other end. And Alan, thank you for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to be with us again next week. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.